properly. So we go to After Effects and we go File, New, Project, and that's what gets you to where you are now. So if I click on that, File, New Project, I get this clear screen. But that's only an empty shell. It just means I now have a workspace. It doesn't mean I have anything to create inside the program, because what the program needs, what After Effects needs, is a thing called a composition, which is like a screen and a timeline where animation takes place. So composition, new, composition. And that gives us this, so we can have a composition name, and we'll just call this, say, first lesson, and the preset needs to be this: HD TV, 1080, 25. So that means we're at full HD, 1920 by 1080 pixels at 25 frames per second. And that's the frame rate for most broadcast systems in the world. So Chinese TV, for example, New Zealand TV, Australian TV, most of Europe, parts of England, well, actually no, all of England. There's another standard, which if we go down to this one here, 29.97, that's the American standard. And that's kind of it. America and perhaps Japan. My knowledge might be old on that. Our resolution talks about the image quality, which is a way that we can manage memory, because what happens with After Effects, it loads all the animation into the memory. So the more memory that you have on the machine, the better. Otherwise, we can use resolution to control how much playback we have. This doesn't change what happens to our final result. It's just for previewing while we're making. So I'll keep with half. But what is interesting is that unlike most programs that you have an infinite space, like say for Premiere when you're editing video, here in After Effects it asks you to specify a very specific time. So I'm setting mine to what yours is, which is around 30 seconds. That's a default value. Background color, I'm going to, let's just move that onto screen. I'm going to set that to white. And I click on OK, and we get a white screen, and we get this thing called first lesson, which is our composition. I'm just going to change my zoom so it's fit up to 100%. There we go. So parts of the program. We have in this thing called project, this is called a bin. So this is where all the content will go. Here is our viewport, so this is what we get when we render. In other words, when we turn our compositions into final video. And then here at the bottom, we have the timeline, and that deals with how we create animation. And this is where we'll be focusing most of today's lesson. At the top, we have tools. On the side, we have palettes. So just like Illustrator, just like InDesign, just like Photoshop. And of course, they're all made by, they're all owned by the same company. We're going to choose this, the rectangle tool, because today we're going to look at basic keyframes and motion paths and acceleration and deacceleration. And so those are the basic things. If you think about all the videos that we looked at yesterday, that covers most of how things are made. Also, we have we'll also look at this thing called transitions as well. Transforms, I should say, transforms. So, first of all, you see, I've clicked on this tool, and it's given me the options of a fill color and a stroke color. So it's just like Illustrator. Yes. I've clicked on stroke, And there we go. My stroke options, I've chosen none. For the fill, I'm not going to click on the word now. I'm just going to click on the color chip, and I'm making sure that is set to black. Now, just like in Illustrator and Photoshop and InDesign, if I hold down the Shift key and I click and I drag, then I get a square. Now, as I've drawn this on the screen, there are two things that have happened. You'll notice here that there is this little target thing, and then there is the square itself. What the target thing is the center of this whole shape layer. So there's a shape layer, it's the size of the entire composition, and it has its center point there. The only thing in this shape layer is this little square. Now, if I go to my transform node and choose rotation, we see that it rotates about that center. Now, I would rather that it rotated by itself. So what I need to do is I need to get that into there, and there's a couple of ways I can do that. The first is that I can use this tool, the pan behind tool, and I can get that center point and I can drag it around. To get it into the exact center is going to be an imprecise situation. I'll just undo things a bit. So what I am going to do is that if I come up to layer, I have in my layer set the transform tools, because that has a relationship to this here, the transform node inside the shape layer. It's the same thing, but I'm coming down here and I have center anchor point in layer content. So if I click on that, the thing snaps in the middle. Yep, that's the one.
It's in the middle automatically.
Yeah, so it knows the size of the thing, and then so now when I get rotate and move those, it rotates about itself. So if we look at these other transforms, you notice that anchor point now has some negative numbers. That's another way I can set the anchor point. I'm not going to change that for the moment. Position, I have X and I have Y. So if I get that number and I click and drag, it moves it around. And the same with Y, which is up and down. I can equally get my, let's choose the selection tool, I can equally grab the square and drag it around.
And the number
and the
are
yes,
changing,
yes. With scale, I can make the object bigger and smaller. But if I click on the little chain thing, I can disproportionately scale the object as well. I'll just go Command Z and undo that. And I'll lock those together for the time being. With rotation, well, we've already discovered that. Let's undo that. And with opacity, I can make things fade in and out. And so those are our basic sets of transforms in After Effects. And in fact, those are the basic transforms in most animation packages. So let's look at how we create this thing of movement. First of all, I have a position in, I have a location and position, and I also have a location in time. So I have a spatial relationship and I have a temporal relationship. This creates a different place in time. It's a thing called the playhead. I'm making sure it's at the beginning. Because at the beginning, I want my square to be here. And let's say in 2 seconds time, I want the square to be over here. What I need to do is I need to tell After Effects that I want to record the position in one place and then the position in another place at another time. To do that, we click on the stopwatch icon. So if I select that, so I select that, and it creates a little wee blue diamond. Now, if I just move along, we see we have the same thing happening here. Little wee blue diamond. So that's recorded a time and a place. If I go to another time, I can grab the square and drag it to another place. And we get a kind of string forming behind. And so now, if I just scrub forwards and back, I've created animation. To preview that, I have these preview controls here. So if I click on the space bar, I get it to play. But then it keeps on playing throughout the rest of the composition. So I have 2 seconds of action and I have 28 seconds of waiting. And of course that's really inefficient with our time. So this grey bar here, if I click and I drag on that from its end positions, I can set the preview area. So if I press the space bar now, I have set the looping of the animation to be shorter.
Right.
Now, let's look at one more piece of the interface. This little area here, small mountain, slider, big mountain. The slider allows me to zoom in on time. So when we set up our composition, you don't have to do this, composition settings, it's 25 frames per second. So we see 0 frames, 5 frames, 10 frames, 15 frames, 20 frames, and then 5 frames later, 1 second. I can zoom right up so I see each individual frame, because sometimes we do have to do our animation frame by frame, especially with very detailed things. At the moment we don't need to worry about that. There are a couple of shortcuts. If I press the B key on the keyboard, it sets the beginning of my preview area. If I scroll around somewhere else and I press the end key, the N key, that sets the end. So B and N are right close to each other. So that means I can just preview a very small part of the animation. Let's come to here, let's press end, let's come to here, let's press B. Yeah?
Yeah.
Any questions?
So far so good.
Okay.
No questions.
The speed of an animation is the time it takes to cover a certain distance. The same as driving a car. The distance, if we say from one fixed place to another, from Auckland to Hamilton, never changes. But if I get between those keyframes with those key places with less and less time, the animation moves faster. The drive to Hamilton happens quicker. So I've now dragged my second keyframe to around the 15 frame mark. So now if I press play, it moves a lot quicker. And of course, if I squeeze it right up, it positively zips along. But the thing is, it zips along so fast that it does look like three stills very close to each other. So with animation, it's all about the timing. It's the balance between motion, well, the way something moves and the speed it takes. Quite often, students will do this with their first animations. And so that when we play that, we already know what's going to happen. And that's rather boring. Okay. Let me, and later on, I'll show you a trick which we can use for scaling multiple keyframes. I'll just mark the end out there. This empty square here is a keyframe. Here is a keyframe. These little dots here in between represent one frame of movement. The closer the dots are together, the slower we're moving. Notice I'll move the keyframe. See how the dots get closer together? And of course, the faster I go, the bigger the gap. Let's hang on to that bit of information. Also though, as well as the keyframes and the frames, you see there are two circles. The circles are handles of a Bezier curve. So just like the same thing you have in other Adobe products, if I grab that and I pull the handle, I can now create a path-like movement. Let's accentuate that a touch. Now, keyframes don't happen one parameter at a time. So as I'm doing that, we could also think about, well, what about the vectors of movement of this if it was an object, a living object, because things don't turn corners without changing their orientation. So if I get the scale, for example, and I'm going to align it about its midpoint. So I've just changed the first parameter. I haven't set a keyframe, so it stays like that the whole way. If I turn on rotation though, I'm going to say that at this point, at the apex of the curve, we're going to be flat. At this point here, about midway down the curve, my slope is now going to be like that. And then, whoops, just slightly adjusting the wrong thing. Then along here, it flattens out again. And let's say that on the upswing, that the orientation's gone like that. So now if I play the two things back, it looks like it's actually following its path. Let's just get that to play back real time. There it is. It suddenly has character. It behaves close to the real world. And that's what gives us the appearance of life, is the way that things behave to the rules of locomotion, the rules of physics, and the rules of cause and effect. If you have an animation that you don't like or you need to adjust, you can grab multiple keyframes and move them. You can grab all the keyframes and delete them. You can get keyframes, you can copy, and wherever you move the playhead, you can paste them and they remap to there. So now, whoops, let's just extend that out. So the animation plays through. Now you see in this part here, it loops back all by itself because we had a keyframe from that point, and then we set a keyframe at that point. So the machine calculates that route back for us. Let's just delete everything. And I'm going to click on, I'm just going to get the rotation back to 0. So it appears to be behaving itself. In fact, I'm just going to keep it like that, just how you have things. Because what we can do, let's go composition, new composition. I'm making another composition. Let's call this box falling.
Box form.
Because in this one, let's draw another black square. We're going to think about an idea of follow through. So again, I've drawn a square. This center point is off somewhere else. And I've used one of the many shortcuts to center the rotation. Yes, works nicely. The way that I did it, I'll just undo that. Whoops, too far. So there's my shape player. There's that there. If I hold down the command key and double click on the pan behind tool.
Double click.
Yep. It puts it in the center. Nice. There's also a keyboard shortcut, but you have a different keyboard to me, so there's no point us going through that because you'll just be going, and that's not exactly a good learning experience. Now, you'll see that I just have an individual parameter here, and that's because I'm using shortcuts. If I press T, I get opacity. If I press, so just think of transparency, which is the opposite of opacity.
C.
If I press R, I get rotation. If I press A, I get anchor point. If I press P, I get position. And if I press S, I get scale. So that works quite nicely with a, and I'll just put it up here so you can see it. I'll just make my point size very large and making sure that my text is black. We have this. These are the parts of animation: position, anchor point, rotation, opacity, transparency, and scale. Parts. What are the parts of my animation? That is these. So, once again, P, A, R, T, S.
So, opacity
Is transparency.
Transparency.
If something is 100% opaque, it is 0% transparent. If something is 100% transparent, it is 0% opaque.
I got it.
Yeah, it's just then we would have paros or ropers, or I guess you could have saw, which would work, but they went with parts. Now,
Parts is better.
I'll just hide that. The way that I hide a layer is by poking the eye out. Can't see it, we're blind to it. Yeah? Notice that the type itself is quite crappy looking. That's because my resolution is half. If I go full resolution, nice and smooth. But I'm staying with half resolution simply because it's a better way to manage the memory of the computer.
So the preview will be smooth.
Yes, when I do a proper render, it will be to the full quality. But at the moment, in the working stage, it's a bit rough. It's like making a piece of furniture. We cut the wood and then we sand it. Changing the resolution is a bit like the fine sanding process. When we have hundreds of layers and lots of parts, the computer will run slower. It will use more memory.
Exactly.
So controlling resolution helps to improve performance when we're previewing. So let's carry on. We're going to discuss the idea of follow-through in animation. Later on, I'll show you actually, no, let's do it right now. If I go to the internet and we look at the 12 principles of animation, don't worry, it's all in the screen capture. If I go to videos and it's interesting how you get different search results on different computers you use. But that's the one that I'm looking at. Is that the one? Oh, that one will do. Well, it's slightly different, but and we'll explain all of these through the course. But this idea of follow-through and things moving in arcs and slow in and out, so there's arcs being mentioned right there. Secondary action, so it's a bit like adding a bit more life to things. We could look at it many different ways. So there's a link on Moodle for this. Let's come back to here. So I'm going to start with the idea that here's the concept. The square's going to come in, it's going to be affected by gravity, it's going to bounce, and it's going to come to a stop. That's the basic sketch idea. So first of all, I'm going to just bring the scale down of mine. You don't have to do that. I'm just thinking about the staging. So first of all, I'm off screen. I'm going to come to position and I turn that on. So animation. At the beginning of time, so my playhead's at the beginning. I'm off the screen. Let's just say moving up a bit. Let's say that in 2/3 of a second, I have come and I have hit the ground. Then, sometime later on, I am going to bounce up. And notice what this is doing, and we'll address that really soon. And then a bit later on, I'm going to bounce down, and I think we can imagine what's going to, and then I bounce up a little bit less, and time gets shorter, and so on. And then maybe just one little bit more.
So the time becomes shorter and shorter?
Yes, as the amount of bounce gets smaller and smaller. And it's just like when you drop a rubber ball or a golf ball onto a surface. boom, 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 boom.
Right.
Now, I'm giving myself a little bit of time afterwards, pressing the N key and pressing the space bar. And that is what we call pretty awful animation. It's starting, and now this is the whole thing
Natural.
yeah, it's not natural at all, and it needs a lot of polishing. So let's pause that. And the first thing we see is that these paths are quite shocking. So what I'm going to do is I select a keyframe, and I'm going to start using the handles of the animation and going to start changing the way that they are behaving. So we see that when I click on a keyframe, sometimes it just appears as a couple of dots, but I'll be able to grab those. Now, if I grab this, and you see how they're sort of behaving together. I don't necessarily want that. Instead, I'm going to come up here to the tools and choose the pen tool. Right up here. You see that?
Yes.
Because now when I get my tool close enough to the handles, it turns into that kind of greater than sign. And that means I can adjust each handle half. So if I do that, I might just have to zoom out a little bit for that. So I'm moving that handle up. Like that. I'm using the space bar to navigate around my scene. So I'll just might move that up a little bit more. There we go, so something like that. Going to now use the select tool and choose my next keyframe and go back to my pen tool, and I'm going to make sure that this is even. And that I'm going to grab this handle and pull that up. And I repeat that process. So select that keyframe, grab this pen tool, and come on now. Let's just go to the convert vertex tool straight away. There we go. And selecting that. Now the way that I'm turning it from the convert vertex tool to the select tool is by just using my finger on the command key.
Okay.
So let's do that. Select that, pull them out a bit. Might just shift that. And I'm using my mouse wheel for zooming in and out. Now, for you, on a touch keyboard, well, a touch surface, just use 2 fingers.
Oh.
And then you can use the space bar for moving things around. Yeah. Now that looks a little bit lopsided there. So what I have discovered is that if I just click using this tool into here, it gets rid of those handles. So that means from this keyframe, I can just set the bend by using the outgoing handle from the tangent point on the curve. It's all those really boring maths conversations suddenly having some actual value to us. Yeah, that's starting to look good. So you can see what I'm doing, right? Okay, so if I play that back, it feels a bit more like an actual thing.
Yeah.
You good with that?
Yeah.
Needs a bit more work.
Yeah, I need to practice it
Yes.
to get the natural action.
Well, again, there's still something wrong with the timing here. It needs work. So if I look at all these keyframes, you know, I might want to move them a bit closer. But it's around here where it gets too slow around there. So again, I could get all those keyframes, and maybe now it's going to get too slow about there now, I think. Oh no, that looks all right. Now, before I was saying we have a shortcut if we want to adjust all the keyframes together. Might just move that one there. Because that's working well, but is it the overall speed that needs work now? If I select all the keyframes and I hold down the Option key, I can scale them all out as a group. And you see that I've moved things so it's going a lot faster, but their relative distances to each other, they stay the same. So holding down the Option key. Yep. Select all, hold down the Option key. And click and drag. Yeah, see how they all scale.
Right.
Yeah? Awesome. So, I've scaled mine down now. Let's see what the playback does. That ain't so bad. Now, I'll just get all of them and I might just fine tune that first movement. Yeah.
So basically, it needs to keep polishing
Yes.
again and again.
Yeah.
Okay.
So get one good thing done at a time. Because now we're going to add in some secondary animation. When it comes in, I don't want it to be landing flat because I think it would just go poof and then slide a bit.
So you
To
mean,
get that kind of bouncing thing, if we think about if you throw a cardboard box on the ground, what does it do? It just goes. But if it lands on a corner, then it can go ba-dum, 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 ba-dum.
yeah.
So let's add a corner in. So I'm going to now just open up all the transforms because I'm going to set my initial, grabbing the wrong thing again, position of the rotation. So I'm going to say that the rotation's going to be a bit like that. So it's coming in at an angle. Yeah? Doink. So if that happens, then if I come to here, I'm going to set a keyframe. So I'm turning on rotation, and that means when we get to the top, if we think about the forces, of physics. It's going to hit there, and by the time I get to there, it's going to have rotated around.
Just like a ball.
So, boring. And then, so that means when I get to this point, I'm still rotating forward. Bounce, bounce. Forward again. Keep on rotating in the same direction. And then maybe here I could just have it slide a little bit as well. So X and Y, as I was saying before, and then I just might make it do that a little bit too. So now we have, and now it feels like a real thing,
Right.
doesn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so and that's kind of where we got to in the lesson. You know, because there's a lot of wandering around and checking on everybody because we have to move as a group. I'm going to go to another composition. And this one I'm going to call, I'm going to call it acceleration. I click on OK. Just for the sake of being constant, I'm going to make a square and I'm going to hold down Command and double click on the pan behind tool so it's got its location centered. Let's say that I'm going to have two of these things. So if I get this layer, shape layer 1, and I come up to edit and I can choose duplicate. So that means now I have two things. Now this one here I need to
Command D.
Yep. So they both now have their I'm just going to put layer 2 underneath layer 1 because see layer 1's on top, and just trying to maintain a sense of logic between what happens in the timeline and what's happening on the screen. Logical. So if I say with layer 1 I press P for position, I'm turning on animation, and once again in 2 seconds it's going to, there we go over there. This one I'm going to do the same thing. So I press on layer 2, P, I turn on a stopwatch. Notice that I returned the playhead to home, to the very beginning, and so I've set a keyframe.
Okay.
Let's just open them both up, transforms, and going to exactly the same position. I'm going to drag the box to the same place. I'm pressing at about 3 seconds the N key, and I'm playing it back. There we go, 2 things travelling at the same range. But you see, that's it. The travelling in a very unrealistic manner, in that they instantly travel at their full speed and then they stop dead.
Yes.
That's not how things work in the world.
Yeah, maybe in space.
Yes, well, that is a frictionless vacuum, so things, once they are pushed, they continue until they hit something else. Now, space is filled with a lot of things, it's just that those things are quite spaced far away from each other, no pun intended. Now, if I get these two keyframes and I right mouse click on them, and we have this thing called, hang on a minute, keyframe assistant.
Yes.
It's slightly out of the screen capture, but if I choose easy ease and select that, what I get now is, if I press play, they now move differently to each other.
Yeah. Right.
Because if I just hide the top layer, it accelerates and deaccelerates. It behaves more like a car at a traffic light, because it's going through its transmission, reaching top speed, and then slowing down towards the end. And that's this animation principle of slow in and slow out.
Slow in and slow out.
Yeah.
Just like fade in and fade out. I mean,
Kind of, but if you imagine like this, so let's say that if I'm going to get that animation and I'm going to delete it. So instead, this is going to maybe, well, if I start it in the first sense, its position's going to be there, and then here, and then here. Let's get that. If I play this, it goes up, it goes down. That's very unbelievable. I'm just trying to get those evenly spaced. Good. But if I get these, and I choose keyframe assistant and easy ease, we should see we go. Okay, well that's not quite right. It's getting there. It should be slower at the top. So if I go back a step and I just easy ease that one keyframe, notice that the dots there are getting closer together. So we're traveling slower. That's kind of getting there.
yes.
Okay, let's fix it up properly. I might get the space between, hang on, Control Z. I've got to make sure that I'm exactly on my keyframe. I can use this tool here to navigate to exact keyframes. Because if I'm slightly off, I mean really slightly off, and I move it over like that, you can see that if I zoom right up, my key, yeah, and that leads to unpredictable and unhappy making results.
Yes.
So that gets me to the exact keyframe I wish to change. So I'm going to get that, and I'm going to move that over there. I'm going to get this keyframe, and there we go. So my animation is more like a parabola. There we go. So now that's okay. Still not the best. And that's why After Effects, let's just change that back to normal. Now, how do I do that again? There we go. If I just go Command and click on the keyframe, it removes its behavior. There we go. So it's back to being a normal diamond. And it's going at a constant speed. So what I am going to do is instead I'm going to select these keyframes. And I click on this tool here, the graph editor. And what it gives me is the chance to see, now I want that to fit selection to view. There we go. So I've selected my layer. I've clicked on show the animation graph, and then I've clicked on this button here, fit selection to view. And what it's showing me is the way how the speed is changing, well, how the value is changing over time. So the way that I can change this is that, again, by using the pen tool, and especially the convert vertex tool, I am able to get these points and through their handles change their acceleration and their deacceleration. The only thing is there's one little detail that we have to do. When the positions are locked together, X and Y, we can't do it. So if I right mouse click on this and choose separate dimensions, now I have the chance to look at just the Y position. Or if I click on just the X position, we see that this has a strange little kink on it. If I get rid of that, well, that's not going to help me at the moment, but if I go to my Y position, I'm going to say that here I'm going to go really fast at the beginning. Hang on. Really fast at the beginning, so you can see how the gaps are getting bigger there. And then let's grab that handle. So I'm kind of trying to get it to look like the actual inverted shape of the curve. Let's get that. Alright, that looks kind of cool. Now, it's got a bit funny here. Now, that's because of the Y position animation. So I'm going to just get rid of that. I'm making that nice and linear. Coming back to Y. And if I just get it to play now. So at the bottom, it really feels like bang. So that's quite good.
Yeah, so we can feel the gravity.
Yeah. So I'm going to get these keyframes and using the previous thing I showed of holding down the Option key, I click and drag, and let's make that move at a better rate.
Better.
So we come up. Still not too happy with this point here. So let's just get that Y position there. I'm going to take that keyframe out. That's good. And let's get this one keyframe. Going to go to that moment. And again, looking at my curve editor, I might just pull these handles out, and you can see how they are giving me a really nice relationship to the motion curve. So let's have a look at that again. Up and down. That feels good. And so if we think about that, we come up and we could find that now if I also show the rotation, if I just press R, it's going to replace the X and Y position. But if I hold down the Shift key and press R, it adds it to the things that I'm looking at. Yeah?
Yes.
So, I'm going to leave that view because the curve editor is really quite confusing to begin with. So, turning on animation here. So, as I come up, I might actually be going that way.
So it doesn't matter to care about the direction. I mean the rotation's direction.
Well, that's up to the character of the thing. If you think about some of the ways that you can jump, you know, the body does arch that way. You know, think about the spine. So when you leap as hard as you can, the spine makes you tilt your head back. And then I get down here, and maybe at this point I'll set a keyframe. So I don't need to do anything. I just click on this, adds a keyframe, and from that moment to here is where I will flatten myself out. So watch. Yeah? It feels like it's a thing.
Does, yeah.
Now, there's another rule of animation that's all about creating a sense of apprehension. If I get those keyframes and move them further along, I could say that first of all, if I hold down Shift and press S for scale, that I'm going to turn on the stopwatch and turn off the lock things together, and I'm just going to say that it's going to shrink itself down, and we kind of see how shrinking from the center is not working for us at the moment, and it gets a bit advanced into our first lesson to deal with that. So we'll just pretend it doesn't exist for the moment. But now that when and then as we get to here, so I'm going to add another keyframe, because once it's up in the air, I'm going to get its scale and increase it. And then when it hits, let's say just before, I'm going to add another keyframe, and then as it hits the ground, it's going to squash down, and then I could do some more keyframes so it appears to be kind of rubbery. Yeah? Okay, so we've got the basic idea. How do we deal with this problem? Well, it's just a matter of position, really. So I'm going to add a position keyframe, and then once it's squashed itself, I'm getting its position in the Y. Okay, let's say that's the wrong keyframe there. It's a Y position keyframe, up and down keyframe. So it goes to there. So I'm going to move it down a little bit. So what does that give me? It looks like it squashes down. Yeah?
Yes.
And then I just need to get that and move that down a little bit.
Just like a person jumping.
Yeah. Because in motion graphics, motion is the character. A person, a mouse, a chair is not the character. So things have to move quite nicely. And so to the task. If we go to Moodle, where is it? Motion graphics. In week 1, this is your homework. The black box exercise. Create a short animation to test your understanding of how keyframes work and exercise some of the principles of motion. Remember to reacquaint yourself with the 12 principles of animation, and there's a link. So take a word from the list below and create a semantic animation. I've got a definition of semantic, but the animation is going to be in the meaning of the word. You can only use a black box, but you can use up to 6 black boxes. They have to be black, they have to be square. So, collapse, a bunch of black boxes, another box bashes into them, and they all fall over.
I know what you mean.
A lot like, well, actually that's probably better for collide, but collapse could be a whole bunch in a balancing act. Just think of that game Jenga. Or playful, the playing some kind of game. Is it Ring Around the Rosies? Is it Leapfrog? Is it musical chairs? That's up to you to explore, expand. One could start growing and eating others. Avoid, escape, angry, surround, dance, consume. All easy to understand, but a way for you to explore the potential of animation. And that's the important thing. The animation should be around 10 to 20 seconds. Doesn't need to take forever, because it's the testing of these ideas which is the most important. And that's that. Remember, also, there are videos to watch that deal with exactly what I have been talking about, as well as some examples, more examples of motion graphics. And this one here is a beautiful way to look at what can be done with a box. Okay, I'll stop.